We practically connect everything by USB these days. Keyboards, mice, speakers, phones, even mini consoles are powered by USB. But what did we do before this miraculous connection became commonplace? USB, otherwise known as Universal Serial Bus, was designed by a consortium of manufacturers way back in January 1996, with the intention to standardize the connection of computer peripherals, which at that point used a different number of methods dating all the way back to the original IBM personal computer. Well, I say dating back to, but almost all of these standards were already established, such as the Parallel port by Centronics in the 1970s and the RS-232 port in 1960 by the Electronic Industries Association, but IBM's adoption solidified their use. Released in August 1981, the IBM personal computer was assembled from many off-the-shelf OEM parts, incorporating a custom BIOS, but with the remainder made up from mostly external manufacturers. To connect the keyboard, a 5-pin DIN socket was chosen, a connection somewhat standardized in computing during the early 1970s, by the Deutsches Institut für Normen, or however you pronounce it. This connection was rugged, providing ample shielding, and was typically the only connector to be soldered directly to the motherboard. Although early machines also included a cassette port, again a DIN socket, as a low-cost method of loading software, which was common on home computers of the time. This meant peripherals such as a mouse, printer, modem, or even the monitor needed to be connected through expansion cards, and these expansion cards plugged into 8-bit expansion slots on the motherboard, which would go on to be called the Industry Standard Architecture, or ISA slots. This name was adopted because the IBM PC spawned many clones. After all, once the BIOS was reverse engineered or copied through observation, the other components could be bought from external parties, and soon the IBM PC compatible market was born and awash with machines. The IBM PC model would soon enough evolve into the more powerful AT machine, with the clones of course following suit. But across all these machines you would typically find a video card for plugging your monitor into, a serial card offering 1 or 2 serial or communications, RS-232 ports, and a parallel card, although this was often combined with the serial card. Original IBM machines had slightly different connections, but this is the typical setup the IBM PC would evolve into. So we've got the basics covered, but what about everything else? Well, let's start with the mouse. You could connect that to a serial port. Your computer identifies these as COM ports, and usually your mouse would have a 9-pin serial connection. So plug it in, install a mouse driver, and you have a magical on-screen cursor for programs which are compatible with it. If you didn't have a 9-pin serial port, you could always use an adapter and plug your mouse into a 25-pin serial port. This was the original serial port design, with the 9-pin introduced by the IBM AT model and offering a reduced size, more cost-efficient connection using a subset of the full serial port standard. For most devices of the time, this connection was more than sufficient, although its design means it can be easily confused with a DB9 joystick connection, as seen on the Atari 2600 or Sega Mega Drive for example. If you were looking to connect a device such as a modem, then you're likely to require the full 25-pin port, featuring the full serial port specification. Many, and indeed most devices could be connected via serial port, but one of the main issues was speed. The clue is in the title, as data is sent in a single stream rather than concurrently, with the maximum speed usually 115,200 bits per second. It can go higher depending on hardware, but was generally unsupported by most software and operating systems. So what about the parallel port, or Centronics Parellel port specifically? Well, although the original ports could only master 150 kilobits per second, later enhanced and extended parallel ports could handle up to a whopping 2.5 megabytes per second. Unlike most serial port applications, data is sent concurrently across several of the 25 pins, making it an ideal choice for printers and even devices demanding high speed, such as the zip drive and other storage devices, which take advantage of the bidirectional modes on the later enhanced ports. But this parallel communication had its own problems, the main being that However, the 8 data lines needed to be synchronized with each other, so shoving 8 bits faster and faster down these pins could cause some synchronization issues, limiting transmission rates. USB, for example, uses serial communication, but with technology allowing far greater speed transfer than our faithful serial connections could go. Of course, this technology also allows us to have many USB ports and even additional hubs, but going back to our serial and parallel ports, your typical computer might only have one of each. The problem is, of course, what if you wanted to connect something else? All of your ports are gone. Well, during 1987, IBM stepped in again and launched the PS2 connection. This did away with the bulky keyboard DIN port whilst at the same time giving your mouse its own dedicated connection. However, this implementation wasn't widespread. In fact, it was designed to be the opposite. IBM were fed up with competitors stealing a market they essentially created, and so in April 1987 launched the IBM Personal System 2. This range was designed to supersede their previous models, and as part of the parcel had proprietary architecture, part of which were the PS2 ports. The keyboard interface was electronically identical to the original AT interface, with a smaller 6-pin mini DIN. The BIOS also added routines for the dedicated mouse ports. The range wasn't massively successful, but the dedicated ports did catch on and would begin appearing on rival machines throughout the 90s. They were particularly useful for laptops, for example, which couldn't accommodate larger ports. Just to throw an extra layer of complication in, Microsoft also had their own mouse port design, known as the Microsoft In port. This port was typically provided by an 8-bit ISA card, and used a mini DIN port similar to those found on PS2 machines, but with a 9-pin design. Again, this was another plug-in card when expansion space may have been at a premium. Thankfully, change was coming. So, although it was common at the time to have separate plug-in cards to manage the serial and parallel ports, including some obscure ones such as this Tandy all-in-one adapter, from this point it started to become common to see COM and parallel ports have their own header on the motherboard, like this rather grubby example, reducing the need for expansion cards and beginning the transformation of packing most connections directly onto the motherboard, as is common today. Okay, so we've got our printer hooked up, a modem for some sweet bulletin board or even early internet access, and a mouse for gliding through Windows 95. What about sound? Well, that hasn't changed much at all. Sound cards of the time typically had numerous 3.5mm jack outputs and inputs, but as they were seen as a gaming or multimedia accessory, they also usually had this. This is a 15-pin Gameport. It was originally introduced on the Game Control Adapter, a separate board for the IBM PC. By the mid-80s it was often added to serial or parallel expansion cards, but by 1989 found its way onto the first Sound Blaster card, allowing the attachment of joysticks, but also by making use of the redundant pins 12 and 15, allowed for a MIDI adapter to be connected as well, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. The Sound Blaster quickly went on to be the most popular sound card, with many clones following suit. So with that, our PC is wired up and ready for action, but this isn't the end of the story. There were a multitude of other ports that could be brought into the mix, allowing for additional applications. You could buy a SCSI controller to connect CD-ROM drives, scanners, or even hard drives. You could also buy a multitude of products that required their own bespoke expansion cards, meaning not only might you run out of slots, but also system resources. It's with all this complexity which led to Compaq, DEC, IBM, Intel, Microsoft, NEC, and Nortel to get together in 1994 and have a good hard think. Bespoke and incompatible connections weren't in anyone's favour, and so in a great example of companies working together to solve a problem, representatives from each company were dispatched with the goal of making it easier to connect external devices to PCs, whilst addressing the restrictions and usability issues of the current methods. One of the team members working on this was AJ Batt, working at Intel, who then produced the first USB integrated circuits in 1995. This original specification had a standard data rate of 1.5 megabits per second up to 12 megabits per second, and was supported by Windows 95 Service Pack 2, but it took a few years before USB started to become standardized. In September 1998, USB 1.1 was released, which had less timing and power limitations, and was adopted much quicker, with Microsoft describing this the legacy-free PC. All iMac G3s also support USB 1.1. Of course, given the still somewhat limited speed, 1.1 wasn't ideal for external storage devices, even with the file sizes which were typically much smaller compared to today's juggernauts. For Apple users, this didn't really matter, they had FireWire, but for everyone else, USB 2, launched in April 2000, was the point we caught up, offering a high-speed mode of 480 megabits per second. By now, the ball was firmly rolling, and PCs which had had a nominal single USB port started having multiple ports front and back. Legacy connections still hung around, but from about 2010 onwards, they've largely disappeared. Also, since 2007, the USB battery charging release was implemented, and with USB 3 appearing in 2008, offered up to 5 gigabits per second. Pretty much all bases were covered. Which lands in the USB saturated world we currently know now, and appreciate for the most part. USB has definitely made things a lot easier and convenient, but I still yearn for the mess of wires and connections from the 80s and 90s, finding male to female adapters, sorting null modem serial cables from the standard ones, networking up PCs with homemade cables to play Doom. It was splendid. Thankfully, I can still get my kicks playing with old hardware. The rest of us probably don't care. Thanks for watching this video looking at USB and what came before. There's some more interesting videos here. You can subscribe, contribute to my Patreon, give it a thumbs up or a down, whatever you like. In any case, thanks for watching. Have a great evening.